We're going on YouTube now. Sunyata, you can go ahead.
Right, here we are. Well, it's lovely to have us together. This is really nice to see lovely familiar faces. And here we are, apparently strewn across the world and able to talk with one another, hopefully clearly. It's been interesting being back from India, simply 2 weeks. Something appears to be really, really special about Tiruvannamalai, and particularly Arunachala, for how this simply shows up to be. But then moving a body across the world and finding yourself in, well, it's probably not the correct way of putting it, but finding that here we are in another place, and to watch carefully how things show up. There's an inherent perfection in this, in simply relaxing into this. But there's a dialogue which seems to be attributed to an apparent self. For how the world deals with that self, it looks at it like a series of attributes, whether it comes through supposed spiritual process, religious process, psychological process, or number of processes, to organize the conditioning of an apparent self to make it be appropriate for itself to be this. That in getting that conditioning right, one will come to some type of perfection in a self. But that self that looks to be the one that organizes things is really just an attribute. A position of apparently organizing things, but its position is nominal. It's somehow positioned in that of thought, so as self-consciousness, to make things right. And in simplicity, this happens very easily. But when the onus is on illusory things, for seeking for something greater, something better, ideas, perfection, to make a perfection, to overcome aberrations, apparent dysfunctions, it gets thrown into the very knot of the self. Yes, Ekomananda?
Why you are using the self, describe the I and the ego, the body, mind, world, where Sunyata called the self the absolute, the true self, the infinite consciousness. To me, Ekomananda, it sounds confusing. So each time I have to retranslate your words, knowing that what you say, the self means ego, mind, body, world. But Ramana calls the self the the infinite consciousness, the God, the Lord Shiva energy. Would you be able to, explain
Well,
the reason that you're using that?
or that a traditional Advaita non-duality, the notion is that for what can be apparent, supposedly, is through the consciousness. So it assumes that we can be in agreement that, and say something as simple as, I am consciousness. Consciousness awareness looks to be its access to embracing all of this in the waking state. That position of consciousness awareness. So Ramana's process is to say, well, very simply, in the mass of consciousness awareness, that appears as the mass of consciousness awareness, who am I that sees that? And if one goes into serious sadhana or dhyana, any meditation, in the quietude of that, beyond thought, if that proposition is true in the waking state, who am I that sees this is nowhere to be found. Doesn't matter where you look.
That is true.
Oh.
We could not identify who is the seer, nor that we can identify what the self is, but that does not address the labels. But perhaps
The labeling.
Ekomananda is kind of trying to refine the language, so to speak.
There's a lot of emphasis for this non-duality speak on what they call the nomenclature of language, to be very, very particular, not to mislead anyone.
Well, would you say that your your language or your way of approaching non-duality is different to Ramana's teaching?
Not really, but
Things you term differently. You use the self describe the world.
I feel quite. Beg pardon. Sorry for interrupting you. Sorry, the conversation of what seems to be going on in what's called radical non-duality in the West is to glean out everything which looks to be religious and spiritual, because the two territories get blurred. I don't actually find that there's any if it refers to it as I, there's a discomfort in this. Would prefer to say the way this occurs is that the positional self just appears as a namesake for the concerns which have shown up through memory and show up through memory, but merely that, and has nothing to do with this. This is whole and complete, and it's naturally that. It's naturally that. There's nothing to do for this. One just simply relaxes in this. There's no separation. There can't be any separation in this. I could comfortably call it Ishvara and be okay with it. But in radical non-dualist senses, that will drag in all the discourses around religiosity. And for where this language might not be appropriate. You know, there's I think the best way this can come out is just through questioning. Like if we ask questions, if I can encourage you to ask questions, or perhaps look at for the way that things are showing up to be, then it'll become evident what's going on with language, because we develop communication with one another all the time. I mean, fundamentally, that's what we're doing. We're learning how to communicate with one another, you know, and for the subject of it, well, it's nominal. And is what we're looking at very, very clearly is what is not phenomena, but what is noumena, the principal aspect of this. And, you know, you have to be careful with the word absolute, because it looks to be a closure. And in this, there is no closure, because the fabric of this is always ongoing. It's a livingness. It's not of the phenomena, but phenomena happens within it. And the perspective of where a self showed up, that looks to be sort of responsible for the context of that, isn't really the issue, but it's made to be the issue for fitting in or doing things appropriately. The self is positioned like a type of politics within social contexts, whether it be with the self, of the self, in its immediate circumstance of family, siblings, closest friends, community, society, state, a country, a world, universe. All of these things are a context for seeing how this shows up. And so positioned, say, if we look at the self, there's this tendency to look at it like the small a, you know, of trying to become the immersion of this, but it is immersed in this. It is immersed in this. It's only the not of the self, or what's called the ego, and these words are misleading. The ego, I willing, is the issue. But that thing of itself is an illusion. That self doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. And that's the first principal illusion. Because in that, you know, if we use the word maya, that it comes out of Sanskrit, I think, or is it Pali? I'm not really sure. But maya means, it fundamentally means measure, and it means where the subject of an eye is in issue with the object that it sees. So, you know, for what goes on in India is principally systems of yoga that says I, the small self, is looking for union with God. And that would be called Ishvara. But in the West, they simply call it this. And they're more likely to point at an I ego or a not or a contracted self. How we look at existence through, it's a perspective of how we see. So in India, you know, they encourage meditation, but simply to come to that quietude of this showing up as this. But where the self and its thoughts and its interests are only nominal to the utility it's been created for. And it only is interested in that utility. It's not really about good or bad. It's about workability. It's concerned with workability. But the notion of, say, morality, and for where in religion becomes prescriptions and prohibitions is this idea that if you can organize a self in the right way, then it will become enlightened. But you can see the issue of this, because it's using the not of the self for making it wrong or right, left or right, up and down, to say it's unworthy of actually being of this, when in reality it is this. But the self, the conditioned self, says it isn't of this. If it was of this, it would be perfect like this. And it has a set of conditions, whether that onus is on itself or the situation, for how things show up, you see. But this is the not of the self, what they call the contracted self. And the responsibility is thrown back on an ego self to get it right. But that ego self, which is thought arising according to condition, is only nominally organized to be able to apparently do so much. Get food, organizing it, sleeping, do work, like very, very basic things, very, very simple things. But in this is mostly relaxation, because the onus isn't on the self, it's in this. For where notions like we say we trust in God, but then we trust in God and then we put a set of regulations around it for how that shows up to be, or we expect it to be perfect according to how we think that is. You see? So all this encourages this contraction, which in reality doesn't exist. It doesn't exist, but it appears to show up to be so. So for whatever an apparent opportunity is of life showing up as this, let's say, if you're in Tiruvanamalai and you're in the position of doing sadhana, perfectly good, then what is it there to do? It's just simply there to look at this quietude and for what shows up as this. And whether there is an apparent self in it or even needed. Whatever shows up. See? Yes.
Do we have any questions about what Sunyata has said so far about this that he refers to as Ishwara?
I say that a little bit hesitantly because, like in the West, they don't understand that term. We could look at it a little bit more. Out of India, it seems appropriate. See, I don't have any difficulty with the notion of Parabrahm, because it really just simply means this. But because of its nomenclature, a Western mind would be suspicious of that. But also for someone who's, say, Hindu, it also may sort of drag in all the prohibitions and prescriptions to get it. Like you have to go through all these level jhana to aspire to perception, non-perception, say, which is regarded as the ninth state in jhana. But in reality, that's here.
Maybe have Rama to share his thought on the term of Ishwara and what Sunyata mentioned as this, or the Prabrahma. You're muted.
I think even here it is used interchangeably. One as Sunyata mentioned Ishvara as a super consciousness, the only true, and other things simply Ishvara is referred to as a God uh, in religious way. Okay. Uh, Again, it depends like whom you are talking to. The term is like it depends upon the person. Like if you are talking to a religious person, Ishvara is a Shiva or simply a God. And if you're talking to a meditators or non-dualist or anybody into that process, that path, for them it's universal consciousness or the only truth.
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, this is really interesting because you use the term super consciousness. So, you know, once we bring in like an apparent hierarchy, the consciousness, you know, and look again, a lot of radical non-dualists will totally reject the notion of consciousness, of positioning itself even marginally elsewhere than simply this. Some even deny that there is consciousness, bodies, substance, everything, right? Um, uh, the 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 delicacy of language, if we can get into this first, is that, you know, like something. If I say super consciousness, if I were to say there all there is super consciousness, then, you know, we're likely to start looking at all the city powers and for all number of things to show up for an apparent self. Like, I become super conscious. No, I become super conscious because it's not positioned there. If you look really, really carefully for what that self is that you point at, that's just looking at attributes, expecting attributes to be greater than for what they are or how they're showing up to be. And there's no need for attributes to be any greater. They might refine, they might appear to refine, but none of that's attributed to a self. You know, even everything that looks to be conditioning for, you know, like a small child, in a sense, in its innocence, represents the absolute. You know, you look into a baby's eyes, and, you know, there's no separation, or there's a degree of it because it's been separated from its mother's heartbeat. So now it has to find its mother's heartbeat and find its food. You know, these things could be a contribution to the sense of that contraction that the self does for looking for otherness. But this goes all the way through the scale to make an I am great. You know, and see, you can see this because that I am of itself is just merely attributes all the way through to consciousness. There's nothing that can be named for this to be named. You know, like there's a body, and apparently this speaking looks to be coming out of a personage. But nominally, this is only showing up to be so because it's reflecting a quality which is universal. There's no difference here from there, from everywhere where we are in any way, except for the contraction of the self that sees itself as differences. And not needing to eradicate any of that, because nominally those things just have to do with utility. It works or it doesn't work. It seems to work or it doesn't work. But something about a perspective, there's like, it's not quite correct because there's no separation in it, but there looks to be a perspective in it for where you get this idea that there's a great I am and there's a small I am. but it's only really just one thing. Well, you can't even call it a thing. There's just oneness. But the mind isn't convinced by that because of its conditioning. It looks to see itself as needing to accumulate experience for exactly whatever. It's worthiness. It's worthiness. You know? Or, you know, maybe just simply to overcome a sense of insecurity, fear. But if that's seen in perspective, it's never that difficult. You know, there might appear to be work, but there's no doing it. It just simply, it shows up for something to move this way. And by doing that, there's enough facility and help for everything to work out nicely. It looks like work, a career, a job, but it's not that. That's just what we call it. You know, that's how everything gets divvied up to be organized and just to be organized. You know?
So how does one get to know this? Get to know this?
Well, it is in this. It can't be separate from it.
How does it?
Well, this is where perhaps Ramana is. See, in radical non-duality that's happening in the West, nothing is given of any method. There's no method. You know, one doesn't change anything. It simply looks at it as it is. Change can happen within it.
But the fact is, you can't simply tell people this is it and to transform people. Where if the audience has the opportunity to sit with a teacher for some time in the physical presence of a teacher, or have the opportunity to do direct eye gaze, this could change people's life shifts. But in terms of this sort of a Zoom session, how could this theoretical talk could lift people's spirits?
Or is it theoretical talk?
It appears to be so.
Yeah, it appears to be so. And, you know, there can't be any teacher or guide, but sometimes it appears to be so. You know, the only for anything that looks to be ascertained is really just a reflective quality, like almost like a remembrance. Sometimes how this settles in is it seems to get into the architecture. You look carefully and sort of say, well, you know, is there an ever-present standing self? Really? You know, like as a principal form. You know, the jiva, well, how can you distinguish that energetic form, whether you look at it, you know, as emanating from a biological form with all its attributes out to perception and awareness, or look at it energetically?
It's
where is there a
challenging to accept what Sunyata is trying to say. There's no self, because that's what Ramana is referring to as the self, the truth, the Satchit Ananda means abiding in the self, which has been working for this body for however long the body has been here. So when you say there's no self, it's for someone who seriously follow Rama's teaching, it's contradicting to a degree, not totally. We understand.
Well, yeah, this is the problem of following anything. You know, like really, it's just comparative tools, really, for looking, you know.
Well, if a student without a teacher, well, not everybody will be an avatar. Avatar is like there was no teacher. God made him an avatar, who embodying light embodiment. So most people will have teacher, including Sunyata, that the body is set there speaking now. You know, Sunyata has a living master or masters. So as many other teachers, if we may say.
All these things simply show up as reflections until, you know, it dissipates. It dissipates. It's not necessary.
You say that you are bypassing the stories. When you know the show up thing, the stories, you simply term it as everything just shows up. That does not satisfy many egos.
Well, but look, what is it that, look at it, what is not satisfied? What shows up? The seeker. It's the seeker. And what's the seeker seeking?
The seeker seeks happiness, peace, or some call it enlightenment or self-realization.
Well, enlightenment's obscure, but let's start with happiness. How is happiness not here?
Well, this body is happy, but many people outside suffers from trauma, suffers from lacking experiences, stories.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Stories.
How could one let go of their stories? How could one truly abide in the self or in this?
They would simply say that which is in an iota of a moment. That which is in an iota of a moment. This. You look really carefully. So, you know, there's a terminology what's meant by that. When in an iota of a moment, not even a thought will arise. Not that there's anything wrong with anything, but in an iota of a moment, you look, there's nothing there.
Does that mean in that moment, when there's no thought arising, the individual realized himself?
In the waking state, the space of thought is perfectly fine. But exactly what is a thought? You know, and without going into those small phenomenal things, the point is just to simply look here in this moment. And there's just an immense quietude. And if there isn't, then, you know, we have the opportunity to talk about it.
Does Tahir and the Rama know where to look at in this moment?
There's no way to look at. It's just this, right here, this. And then anything that shows up will be a question. Anything that shows up will probably be a question. You know, and then we can talk about it. You know, when you're in sadhana, right, meditation, then all there is this in an iota of a moment. There's no substance to it at all. It's totally empty. But that is awkward for the smaller self because it's volitional. It will go, but what? It wants something it can utilize, because the self is organized, that lesser aspect of an apparent self is organized to get something out of something, to maintain the reflection of itself, to see itself in reflection, building on itself to become greater and greater and greater. Oh. Thanks, Taki. That's fine, love. Yeah, slowly, we'll get language if we do it. You know, you and I should try to talk with one another one-to-one sometimes. That's perfectly good, love. I've got endless time for you, love. Even if we just sit quietly and say a few words. Endless time. It's all, you know, perfectly good. Thank you for mentioning that. But you can see it. All perfectly good. Yeah, that might be useful. Sorry, there's some dialogues going on. Yeah, all good. But something shows up, you know, like to have the one-on-one, I would encourage it. You know, Rama, in, you know, perhaps for where, you know, we come into a public speak, you know, there's more awkwardness around, you know, how this shows up, and fair enough, you know, because this isn't an easy platform to be working in. I would encourage, you know, one-on-one, because, you know, the self is self-conscious. It's such a habit of contracting itself down into an appropriateness. And it does this in relationships, because relationships are political. They organize themselves for utility according to how that occurs to that self, through each their own conditioning. So, you know, there's all this is, you know, why these situations can feel like Maya, uncomfortable. You know, for people show up with that, if you like, ego form, and function wholly and solely out of that. So there's no room for this conversation. Because the ego won't allow, it won't even hear it. Because there's nothing to get. There looks to be nothing to get. So this, which looks like a self, which is an illusion, or how the whole world looks to be through, misses all of this because it doesn't need anything of that. Doesn't need anything of that self. So this resides in this, which is magnanimous, but also empty. And what looks to be the knot of the self, that contraction of self-consciousness, loses its grip. But it has to be seen for what it is. A set of attributes which maintain their own authority, even for what it sees to be incorrect in itself, in that self-consciousness. And this is a little hard to get. So, we can talk about the dilemmas of people, because that knot of the self also creates its own drama. What people call in India karma, a causality that comes out of the knot of the self for it to appear to be even right. And its emotions and the subsequent thinking and thoughts that follow that emotion make it be right even more so. It's profound. But something of this, it has to be loosened up somehow, but it's or seen for what it is. So, there's multitude methods, therapy, all number of things which can help in creating perhaps contrasts. But still, those contrasts are apprehended by the self for what it feels to be appropriate and maintain the very knot itself. It's a dilemma. A self, that illusory self, is the dilemma. It causes all the suffering. It doesn't mean that there's not pain in a body, or that one, has moments where you have to work out how to communicate through something. It doesn't mean that it doesn't hit conglomerations of thought which stimulate emotion, but it's seen differently. It's just simply that. Attributes working or not. Because it's all fluid. It's not to be, this doesn't need to be in a fixed state. But it still seems to have preferences. But if those preferences collide with the natural flow of life, then it simply moves this way, moves that way. It's not holding on to a self, trying to get it right from a self position. You see the dilemma of this? You see this dilemma? But if that of itself can't think itself out of that, that's why it comes to an apparent crisis. It goes, enough. It sees that it's part of the drama, and it goes, no, enough. Not that anything else might change. Not even that shows up as a self. Because some of that conditioning, could eradicate itself and go to zero, like die to itself. Right down to where it functions in a way where it doesn't need any mind at all. Well, really, this is what's happening anyway. But it's very subtle. But what's called the ego of the self claims that everything that's going on in its life is because of it, for good and for bad, the whole lot. When all those attributes were given. There isn't any self here. Everything that it was conditioned to be was given. There's nothing original as a self. It's really interesting. But supporting it all and always has been this. And it's never, ever been separate from it. But the onus is put down on a self to get it right. Get it right, 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 get it right. And when it comes out with one small thing, oh, look how great it is. No, this is rubbish. It's not like that. That happens workably is just happening because it's in accord with everything. It's, like you can't separate this. It's like, fish swimming in an ocean at best. Not even that. It's the ocean of itself. But this looks at it as the waves. And says, there, that's the self. The aberrations or the parts that seem to stand up. It says mine, I, mine. No. It's not true. And just gently, it becomes apparent. Simply this. Not because anything needs to change, but things change. Everything's in change. It moves with it more. All of a sudden, that looked to be like clustered down like this is just really this. And, like a functional utility of conditioning, which is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with the conditioning. It might seed to modify those things, but it just shows up. It goes, it could speak for that better. It could say that maybe better. The way it learnt that wasn't, it appears like that. And all of a sudden it just goes. And it softens. It just slowly, gets seen. It's just like, okay, it's the question, the thing isn't, the attributes aren't at fault. They either work or not. Nothing that's ever happened that looked to be good or bad was anything other than it seemed to not work. It collided with something because it wasn't working over there, some type of accident. That self-consciousness was inscribed on herself somewhere way back in its childhood or infant for, what was first, perhaps just parents trying to protect the baby. But then all of a sudden it gets a name. It gets given a name, and then all of a sudden it's encoded like law. You have to get it right. Get what right? Well, what it loves. Movement with people, helping one another, using those attributes in its fluidity, because there seems to be creativity or something in it. Or not, whatever way it shows up. It's not to cut it off from life. This isn't about renunciation. But, it might choose not to live very, very simply. Maybe not a life of renunciation, just a life of simplicity. It might look like a life of renunciation, but it's not a life of renunciation. It's free. But free in the principle of just being immersed in this. Free to be immersed in this. For what Ramana calls the mass of consciousness awareness. And who am I that's everywhere, throughout, and in this? This. Ishvara, if you like. Or even Maya. Doesn't matter. Or looking at the measure of things, of objectivity and subjectivity. All in perspective. It's, proportions and scales. Also Maya. All of it. There's no duality in it because they're simultaneously so. There's there in all reckonings, there's an availability, there's utility and no need for utility because the mass of it is just simply happening. More like a river. More like a river, like it's just moving down, and people are opinionated. Well, we can see that, and we learn to be more gracious with one another. And you can see that, people function in a way which is okay, maybe a little bit hard on themselves. That's all right. You travel lighter. You cooperate too. There's what we would call in India bhakti, but it's just serving this anyway. You can't separate it. This does the dishes nicely for everyone, not for this or for that. It's just this. There's no separation. There never has been. Never has been. There seems to be disagreements and ideas like this and emotions that rise, but that's all. They just seem to show up to be so. Even what appears as memory in the past is not fixed. There might be a delicacy in that too. Mm-hmm. Mm. And something of this message sort of slips in. There's this can't guide this. There can't be a teacher in this, but we can speak of this somehow. It's interesting. It becomes interesting. And a few of us come to this position. In India, it looks like sadhana, dhyana, yani. Looks to be knowledge, but it's free of that too. You can use that architecture. But this is about liberation. What in India, so we can't use this term in the West, jivan mukti, liberation from the self. Jivan mukti, mukti, mukta, liberation from the self. And what is that? Well, it's immersion. No self is lost. It never existed. It was just a namesake around the set of attributes held in tension to be right. There's nothing wrong, and the attributes might be perfectly fine, but they're held in constriction. Like, be right, be right, be right, be right, be right, be right. No. It goes beyond right and wrong. It has nothing to do with any action. There's no action in it. There's nothing to do. There's really nothing to do. So for wherever we are, and it's all privileged, really, all supported, really, look carefully for where it is right now. And so for what looks like a rarefied position of, like dhyana, of deep contemplation, of a meditative state, of moving more gracefully through life. These are just terms. But it appears to be so. And whether one, one can do anything, one can look at it in any which way. If it's sadhana, there's nothing wrong with sadhana. Sadhana, wonderful. You can look really carefully, see what's showing up. All this, it looks. What's the self that is in this? It's not to be found. It can't be, because it's noumenal. It's noumenal. It's not the attribute position of where it once sat as an ego trying to get it all right. getting it right is just simply basic utility, and it's easy. It just goes like this, cooperates, it moves, it does a little bit of bhakti sometimes. It moves more lightly. It's not looking for a special position because it's already this. There's nowhere to get to. Nowhere to go. Doesn't need to. But that shows up as the not of the self will question it. It comes up straight away. In this, for any of this that's getting through, the not of the self will protest for its circumstance. And really, it would be good to talk about that. Well, we could. We don't need to. I think in these types of public forums, sometimes when that type of thing comes forward, it creates like a situation where people can see this a little bit more particularly. Josh is here. Hello, Josh. Oh dear. Hey, love, how are you? Nice to see your face. Looking very nice in your white shirt, young man. Very lovely. Good, good. Everything happening nicely. You can give me just hand. Very good. That's the perfect mudra. The perfect mudra. You know, like there we go. You know, like this. You know. This speak, you know, for as much as the radical non-dualists like to say, it's just sort of happened now as ancient too. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. And, you know, this perfect quietude, you know, in the world of entertainment and self-egos, such silence isn't appropriate. The not of the self, it says nothing's happening. It's always looking for experience. Hmm?
Or isn't that true that before you can expel the experiences, before you can be free from seeking for any experiences, the experiences do need to take space.
Well, you're free to.
I think one, Ramana did not become awakened overnight. Something happened to him. Why it's a godly event? And let's say he encountered the fear of death intensely, and that awakened the true self. Let's say so. That's an event. Therefore, it is truly, I mean, well, normal for everyone to desire something special or profound awakening experience to happen to the body. I mean, that body sitting there speaking, sharing your experience, Sunyata.
Well, it's looking for an adventure. The self looks for an adventure and adds on to itself through experience. So, like if that was its intent, then by all means, it's free to do so. Like do the death meditation, and what would happen? Well, it could go through and sort of speak about these things and for how many times an apparent self gets completely knocked out, right? But then out of that conditioning and also out of the circumstance of where the collective mind works. Because you have to understand that this conversation is really rare. And I'm not meaning to make it special. It's very, very rare. Because most people are working out of the ego self. And the ego self is where all the attributes sort of land to be a great I am. And everyone wants the life of that. And, people try that on. And we probably all have in different degrees. So what? For wherever, whatever experience, no matter how grand it is just like a bleat. Everything of all those looking for all that intensity and experience, all that aggrandizing. And for that, this shows up as spiritual experience too. Like, okay, go into these processes. You're totally free to do so. Right? Look at it really, really carefully. But look at who wants to have the experience. From where is that coming? In Advaita, it going sort of directly in, and if you I can't speak really for Ramana because it's not appropriate. So then we go in and we have to study all these different teachers for exactly what their life is and how it was. And people have lots of conclusions about what that is, but no one can say exactly what that is. If you go into, say, a death meditation seriously, and all the architecture is dropped out, where there's no nominal self shows up, right? Then you're going to say, well, okay, what? There's no way that standing self can get anything out of that because it doesn't know how to get any of the substance for how that works. But it will jump back to that position because that's its position of safety. And so, we have to be careful here. We could go into that, and you're in the position to do that, in a sense. For where, say, that formal position of sadhana, if we want to talk about that, for sitting in and really seriously going for it, then you have to be prepared to give yourself over to it totally, to die to it. And by all means, I do that and see what shows up. Because invariably that's what it is. As for what appears to be a knot of the self, it seems to get loosened in sadhana. That seems to be the experience that happened here. And at some point, the penny drops. And it happens on every level. It does appear to be experiential, but it's nothing. And it does seem to be conceptual, but it's nothing. It's empty. It's a total emptying out, nothing, no more. And for something in it where all those old cues, which created whatever, just stop. But that's happening here. But the not of the self, that contracted self, that one that claims to be the doer of all this, jumps forward and says, no, this is nothing. This is not it. And in that, there's a type of misery, a suffering. And this could position itself like a guide and sort of say, do this and do this and do this and do this. But it's hesitant to do that. And it's also more patient. Yes.
Do we have any questions before we proceed to silent sitting for some time? Please.
You're often distracted by postcards from the past.
Very true. Very true. Postcards from the past. Nice way of putting it over there.
That's a memory, manas. Manas can have a pull on the bodily experience of turning inward. Whatever journey the individuals are looking for that peace, for that pain-free, for that breakthrough, the manners, the memories of the past, it's like there's this tug of war going inside in the body. The desire of wanting to be free from all the pain is being put down by the memory from the past. So that tightness creates some sort of friction in the body. I mean, this body has been seated very, very closely and examining every single thought in the past however many days, and the body really sits for long hours. The thought becomes so magnified, becomes so large and so aware, the body becomes aware of there's so many thoughts going on. So we're counting these thoughts, how many of them are there. We didn't realize that we actually spend so much energy into the thought, into the world, until we sit down, we have this moment to examine this bodily function. It's a bodily function. It's a natural natural way of doing. Something just happens. But we seem
And the
to
thoughts,
don't.
the thoughts are the same thing. You know, they get thrown off by feeling states in the body. And, you know, personally, I think, you know, like it's reasonable to look at the perspective, perhaps what Ramana is saying, in that these are occurring in the space of consciousness awareness, or the vastness of this. And, you know, they are just paper thin. You know, they're just memory. And not to discard them, not needed to be discarded, all perfectly fine. You know, even fine to file them away, perhaps, if that's where it is. For where it might be sticky, for where it looks like a personal failure, everything sort of showing up to be. These are all ideas, all concepts. But the emotional response to thought is so quick, it makes it feel something. And in feeling something, it feels real to us. But real emotion is not real. You know, it's a chemistry in the body, but it's a reaction. It's a reaction to thought. You know, and there's feeling states for sensitivities for how to be in the world, which is perfectly fine, organic and good. It's good to be aware that one's in the vicinity of snakes, but it's stupid to walk around in fear of snakes all the time. You see, one's a concept and one sort of just shows up to be so. And there's a subtle difference. So, you know, like it's all fine for everything to show up, but things need to be seen in perspective. So there's an okayness in immersion of consciousness awareness for the perspective it seems to create, because something of that voluminousness of a thought becomes something very, very small. The scale in context to the whole of this is very, very small. And, you know, then it looks and says, well, you know, honestly, what's useful about that? You know, once something happened with myself and my father, apparently, and it got made to mean this, and it cuts a path until it sees that that of itself is not really anything at all. Or what was necessary of it was only this much, for creating a type of stability, perhaps. You know, something which gets, you know, for the conflicts that happen between people, you know, like the message could be done really, really well or not, you know, for whatever value in these things, but we hold them. Or being right, or trying to be right, or trying to satisfy everything. But that's the self-conscious not. But it has to just be seen in perspective. It's not this big, it's this big. In the space of this. And really, in the end, for how memory shows up is just a plastic ingredient for its usefulness or playfulness. It can be playful. It might be just part of the vocabulary. Yeah, it could be for dancing. Yes, love.
In the this that does not exist.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, yes. You couldn't say it doesn't exist or does exist. It's sort of, yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Underlies maybe everything. it also appears in that emptiness, recognizing that emptiness as it. This is of that, even for what is called a self. That's why it's interesting not to attribute a self or the not that it can, because the not, the thought is also everywhere in the waking state, which is perfectly fine because it's looking to be able to sort of find an apparel, something useful. That's okay too. It can use that too. It could be useful as well. To relax into the mass of consciousness, awareness, and that seems to be beyond that. There's a subtle apperception for where no self can be grasped, that seems to be everything throughout that. It's not in the body anymore. It's not in, well, to say thought is fine because that is what we're really meaning as consciousness too. Thought becomes its right meter. It's voluminous, it's not pinpointed. It's coming from everywhere simultaneously. That seemed to be mind is not limited. But you can't call it mind because once you call it mind, it goes back into the contraction of where it is in those attributes. It's not of that. So, we just come back to calling it this. For where we might not call it Ishvara because it looks to be something distant, so long as there seems to be a jiva positioned in a nominal circumstance. It's not that. But it's not some glorious otherness. It's not superconsciousness or an altered state. There's no state in it. It's empty. Neither perception nor non-perception. Neither perception nor non-perception. In that also pointed at what Ramana is saying about the mass of consciousness awareness. Neither perception nor non-perception. An iota of a moment. In an iota of a moment, there's a language, nomenclature, and it seems to point at qualityless qualities. It's not of a quality, but what emanates beyond it seems to be clarified somehow. And it's learning to reside in what its natural state is. It's not a state, it's a stateless state, but it's a natural state. It's in and throughout all of that. And relaxing into that. Coming back to this, in a sense. A remembrance. It's like a baby, but with the facility of what it is to be human too. With apparent attributes, abilities, sensitivities, loves, all these things too. But in the clarity of that consciousness awareness. It's so immediate. It can't. None of the there's no way to perceive this. It's at the edge of it all. It's a natural state. It resides there. That this is the natural state. It's not a state, but there's no way of speaking about it properly. Has to use such terms. And then it travels lighter and it enjoys. The seriousness. You can't take it seriously. And this is exquisite. This, just relaxing. Mm-hmm. No need to come to anything, nothing to get to, nothing to get. Everything can wait, the world can wait. quietude, this natural quietude of this is always here. And it's perfect exactly as it is. Nothing to change, nothing to get to. This resides in this with no separation at all. Never has it been separated. So enjoy this quietude, even in busy places, even with apparent thoughts rising, even with apparent self showing up, or whatever. Always this quietude underlying. Gently, gently, things just seem to melt away. The importance of old stuff seems to get fixed. Everything's fine. Thank you for showing up tonight. This is really nice to see you. It's lovely of you. And, communicate with me as you want to separately. You're always welcome. Like here, we can always sort of just gently come through language together, love. Just one-on-one, Zoom is fine. You've got connection with Ekomananda. She can work out how to connect us, and that's all perfectly fine. Same Rama, whenever you want to talk to me one-on-one, all good, always here, for wherever I can work out the time. The body seems to be mostly awake all the time, dear, so, I'm sure we'll be able to find the time. And Anna Marie knows she can connect whenever she wants to. Close. And Josh is tucked away there. He knows too, to connect. Anyway, I love you all. Thank you for showing up. This was lovely, really lovely, really special unit of silence and quietude, just natural. Feel free to connect with me, and or chat or whatever. Anyway, lots of love. Thank you, really special, lovely, lovely.
See you next time.
See ya.
Thank you.
Very great.
I'll see you again.